Terah, so exciting to have you here with us, here in London. Delighted that we could have the founding executive editor of the Partnership on AI at London Tech Week. So prior to the partnership, you were a policy advisor to the US CTO, the White House Office of Science and Technology under President Obama, and you co-directed the White House Future of Artificial Intelligence Initiative, and that engaged industry, academic and technical community, civil society, international stakeholders to formulate recommendations for a domestic policy strategy on machine intelligence. Great to have you here, Terah. I think everyone's really interested to learn a little bit about Partnership on AI. What is it? What's your aim? What's the purpose?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Greg. It's great to be here. Thanks to the summit for having us. The partnership, as you mentioned briefly, is it's a coalition of almost 100 organizations, actually, globally based, that are working together to essentially define parameters and standards for responsible development and deployment of artificial intelligence. So we were founded by a group of really massive technology companies, including Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, IBM, and Google, and a set of civil society interests, actually. So the American Civil Liberties Union is on our board, the MacArthur Foundation, and a number of really, really big NGOs and nonprofit organizations are involved in our work, like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and a host of others, and a set of academic institutions as well. So we're a multi-stakeholder initiative, which is a fancy word that basically encompasses this idea that all these sectors need to come together to facilitate solutions to a lot of the hard problems that AI poses. And that's the set of work that we're really focused on with them.
So you're a pretty broad coalition. You're looking at the parameters that, for presumably where this can be applied within organizations. Do you have sort of like a set of organizing principles or tenets or something that you're all able to sort of agree on as a sort of starting point for the work, or a underlying sort of foundation for it?
Yeah, we definitely do. We have actually literally what we call tenets, which inform all the work that we conduct as a community. They range in their approach to principles from openness and transparency in the field,
yep.
And the way in which the field engages as a discipline with other disciplines and with underrepresented voices in technology policy and technology development to some of them are informed by Human Rights Convention, and a host of other sort of principles that inform our work across the board. And then from a sort of issue area perspective, we actually have a set of thematic pillars, as we call them, which focus on 6 sort of sub-areas of the field, because it's a galactically expansive field, honestly. I mean, you could talk all day probably about just one of them, but they range from safety-critical artificial intelligence to issues of fairness, transparency, and accountability. We have one on collaborations between humans and AI systems. We have a focus area on social and societal influences of AI, which include such questions as how AI influences the media, democracy, and other sort of systemically scaled systems, and then a host of other focus areas, including one on AI and social good. So that's sort of, that's the container for our work.
Right, so presumably the work you're doing, it's fairly sort of, I imagine that there's a lot of agreement on most of the major kind of principles that you're working on. Is the real challenge the kind of like the organizational and the kind of the practical part? How can this be applied?
Yes, yeah, definitely. I mean, well, so first of all, I don't know to say that there's agreement on anything is true, because it's just a really complicated landscape right now. I think, obviously the tenets are principles to which all of our member organizations aspire to as a member of our community, but what you said is actually spot on. It's in operationalizing those in practice that gets really, really hard. And as you and probably many people in the audience have come to realize, there has been a lot of work, especially in the last 2 to 3 years or so, conducted by global governments and other coalitions similar to ours that have drawn together sort of principles or ethical statements for what responsible AI should look like. But very few of them actually go so far as to detail what a developer or engineer should do when they're sitting in front of their keyboard every day at work. And that's where ethics actually happens. And so how those principles get baked into products that are delivered, products and services that are delivered to literally millions and millions of people by these pretty hugely scaled technology giants is really the question that we're trying to answer. So we work really closely with research and development teams at companies, product teams, policy and legal teams, and other stakeholders that are really, really necessary for looking under the hood and figuring out the answer to those questions.
That looking under the hood bit, I think, is the key bit. Like, presumably, one of the great challenges of AI is, as you said, like baking in these principles at the very beginning to ensure that there aren't inbuilt biases. Tell us a little bit about how you think about that. Like, how should organizations be thinking about this from the very first step, making sure that there's the AI is for good rather than for something that's will have a positive outcome?
Yeah, I think it's, as you said, it has to happen from stage zero, basically. So I think the more organizations think about this as a truly full stack set of approaches, the better off we are all going to be. It starts from something as fundamental as like what teams actually look like in their composition, right? So you and I were talking a little bit behind the stage about the diversity of the field. It's, the word I often use is actually horrific. It's really, really bad. It's extremely homogenous and notoriously so. AI is actually worse than computer science in its diversity, especially in the engineering community. Right. And that's really where the rubber meets the road. The teams in these organizations that are building technology really need to have more diverse compositions so that they produce better outcomes for society and for the companies themselves. So there really is, there's a sort of, I think there's a financial imperative for them to do that for the sake of quality assurance, but there's also a sort of societal and ethical imperative for them to do that for the sake of representation. So that's where it starts. I think that there's potential for bias at a lot of other stages as well. There's a lot of discussion right now in the public sphere about the quality and a derivation of data sets and training data in artificial intelligence, which is a real problem when the contexts that are actually helping develop technology themselves are biased. And that's sort of the last part of the pipeline, right? So the question of where you're deploying technology, into what systems and how, is also really, really important. And that is another place where bias can be introduced, and it's really important for organizations to be thinking about.
So do you think also there's a chance of there kind of being almost this double whammy? So at one end you have maybe unintentional bias, and the other, automation will disproportionately disadvantage people maybe who are the least advantaged within society. So it's almost kind of, AI has a lot of obviously positive upsides, but there's this real chance that these two things could become compounded unless we think about A, the kind of like the input, and B, what the effects of that are going to be.
Yeah, I like to say that AI is only as good as people are, frankly. And as it turns out, we're not so great sometimes. So it's really good at perpetuating human biases that are already existent, as you said. And that's especially true when it comes to where AI meets marginalized communities, or where AI meets socioeconomically disadvantaged people, or where AI meets communities that are not involved in the development process historically. So I think that's a problem that we're also trying to help solve. It's a really big issue. Obviously, it's very pervasive, and it's not going to happen by the hands of one organization, but it's mission critical. So it's really, really key.
And tell us a little bit about how that bit works. So you've got big tech. And then you've got maybe sort of like some of the civil society groups you work with. You work with the ACLU and various others. Very kind of like maybe not sort of like different outputs that they want, but certainly they're coming from a very different perspective. One's profit-driven, the other's about protecting the kind of rights of individuals. How does that process kind of work?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think. The simple answer is that we're really in the business of productive disagreement, I think, as an organization. So we were built with the recognition that among the diversity of constituents that we have involved in our work, there is going to be just as many diverse opinions as there are organizations, if not more than that, honestly, because sometimes organizations don't even agree with one another. But I think that finding and building new sets of tools for having these really divergent entities deal with one another effectively and listen to each other more effectively than they are usually able to do, I think is really, really important. So, I mean, we have this baked into our governance structure, actually, so it's that fundamental for us. Our board is split half and half evenly, the directors, in the number of for-profit and nonprofit organizations or interests represented by the actual board of directors, flowing on down through, we have a set of working groups, as we call them, which are sort of attached to those theme areas I talked about previously, and they're co-chaired by a duality, right? So there's essentially a company and a nonprofit interest that converge in those group settings to help set the agenda for those groups and galvanize their peers into action with them. So, and that's not enough, right? The other ways in which we do it is by actually literally sponsoring the participation of nonprofit organizations. So, it is in recognition of the fact that there are power differentials in this sector that are huge, and the companies themselves, we're fortunate, they have come to this work in recognition of the fact that we all need to be in this together, and we're able to afford doing that in part because of their support. But we need to pay those underrepresented interests to situate themselves at the table, and more than that, need to make sure that the table is set for them to meaningfully participate. Right. So even defining a common language, literally, among different disciplines and different sectors when you come to talk about an issue is really, really important. So we've had entire meetings about, like, what does fairness mean, for example, right? Because it's very different depending on the context, whether you're in an engineering role or you're coming at it from a legal perspective, for example. So, so those things are all really important interventions, I think.
Sure, and presumably that means that particularly the large tech firms have got to go away and do a lot of internal work in terms of like educating their own teams and ensuring that some of the principles and the values that you're discussing are applied within their, fundamentally in their products and in their services. I know that you have a big focus on sort of social impact and the benevolent side of AI. Can you talk a little bit about like some ways in which you see AI being able to be used and implemented in this kind of way?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think the partnership was founded in this sort of dual recognition that AI technology holds enormous promise to impact the world in really positive ways, as it does equally to potentially do so in really negative ways, which we've talked a lot about. And I think on the positive side, there are such exciting applications in areas like healthcare, for example. Yeah. I mean, there's like in the field of computer vision and imaging, the intersection there could be really transformational. Depleting the impact of human error in clinical settings. Thousands of people every year die in hospitals because of human error. Yeah. And if we can somehow partner with machines to help reduce that rate, it would be really, really powerful. So in that area, there's some really exciting work being developed. In education as well, personalized learning is a really interesting place that's receiving more and more attention. So I think that's really, really interesting. And I think a third area is in environment and environmental justice and impact. I mean, I think it's probably something well known by now that we have more Earth imaging data than we don't know what to do with it as a species because there are so many satellites overhead. And collecting that information is one thing, but actually processing it and acting on it is another. And in dealing with the effects of climate change, there's this tremendous potential for us using AI machine learning toward really positive ends on that front. So that's another place I'm really excited about AI having an impact.
So can you give us maybe a strong example? We talked a little bit about algorithmic and sort of data bias. Could you maybe give us an example of an example you've seen where the outcome has not been, should we say, optimal?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a really salient one actually. We just did some recent work on In the state of California, there was a bill passed late last year by the state legislature called State Bill 10. It actually abolished the money bail system in the state, but it replaced it with a mandate per county that every county in the state adopt an algorithmic risk assessment tool to determine pretrial bail. Okay. And so what that means is that we have algorithms essentially defining outcomes in incarceration.
I see.
And mandated by a state for the first time. And our community got really energized around this issue across the spectrum. I mean, we had civil society organizations, academics, and people in industry really being responsive to this because honestly, none of the tools that might be used toward those ends are ready for prime time. So we wrote a set of benchmarks and standards essentially for the tools themselves in response to this policy development, with recommendations ranging from literal statistical sort of quality assurance related issues to issues associated with how humans can actually interpret and interact with these systems effectively. So, for example, defining what a confidence interval is to a judge is really important if you're going to put one in front of them. And so, so we put this paper out, and what the outcome is, which is what you asked, is that these systems are trained on really, really biased data because we have an inherently biased criminal justice system, especially in the United States. And it's really dangerous in deployment because they're making assessments about individuals based on aggregate data, and usually in response to factors that are not actually directly related to an individual's chance to recidivate or commit another crime, as one example. So the number one reason why somebody doesn't show up to a hearing is actually usually because they don't have transportation to get there, or they can't find childcare. And thinking about that as the potential point of intervention, and these systems don't take that human factor into account when they're assessing individuals, and so it's really, really important to think about statistics deployed in reality. And again, that just relates to the sort of contextual relationship and the opportunity for deep biases being introduced that we were talking about before.
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting example of maybe how, one of the challenges of AI is that it's incredibly complex, and we actually, as you said earlier on, we don't necessarily know what's going on underneath the hood at all times. So there's kind of like a big trust issue there. Do you think that, okay, I guess the question is, how do we get to that point where we begin to sort of feel that we can trust AI in a way that we know that it's going to be always operating within the parameters and the principles that you're describing and you've set out with the organization?
Yeah, well, I guess that's sort of the million-dollar question. I wish I had a great answer to that. It's really kind of what we're working on. I think there are maybe a couple of factors to define in response to that question. One of them is that auditability, or the capability of having AI systems be understood by the people who are impacted by them and the people who are using them, as was the case in the criminal justice example I just gave, has turned out to be really, really important. So that has become a defining feature of a lot of the conversations happening in the field. How can we, really deeply contextualize technology in deployment? How can we understand the impacts that it's having on people? How do we understand the inputs, and from those inputs, the outputs that we're defining? And how do we make sure that systems are able to change over time as society changes as well? So, a big challenge that the government has in technology deployment, for example, is that you install a software system in an agency and it sits there for like 30 years, right? I mean, we were using, when I was working in the US government, there was no shared document platform that we had the capability of using to work on. I mean, all we produced was paper. That's how policymakers talk to each other. Yeah. And so when you're writing a memo with 40 federal agencies, you have a version control nightmare on your hands. I think when we were writing the AI strategy for the US government, we had like 60 versions at one point, and just figuring out, how to knit all those together effectively is its own problem of technology. But that is a simple problem compared to the sort of revision issues we'll have when algorithms are deployed and they're not responsive to changes happening in context. So I think that's one issue, and again, deeply related to transparency. I think that the capability of the legal system interacting effectively and other systems that we have had for decades and centuries interacting capably and effectively with technology is another really big issue. The opportunity for recourse for individuals to actually have due process in response to decisions made by machines has been another really big topic of conversation in the field. So I think that's also really important. And again, these are sort of at the principle level, not really at the practice level, but there's a lot of work that remains to dig into dig more deeply into some of the answers that I just gave.
And fundamentally, you remain optimistic, you remain kind of positive about the AI future?
I think, yes, as long as we do the work that we have to do to get there.
Well, I think, after hearing this session, I think everyone in this room will be pleased that you're the person doing this important and hard work. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you.